So welcome those watching to another Strong Towns webinar. We have as our guest here Rick Rybeck from Just Economics. And Rick, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, tell us who you are and what your background is.
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you and Strong Towns for hosting this webinar. I'm Rick Rybeck. I'm the director of Just Economics, and we help communities harmonize economic incentives with public policy objectives for affordable housing, job creation, sustainable development, and transportation efficiency. So that's kind of what we do. And it's a pleasure to be with you and to talk a little bit about how we can fund infrastructure in a way that supports these other public policy objectives. Did you want me to get into it now, Daniel, or did you want me to wait?
I think we can go ahead and get into it. So the way we're going to do this is Rick has a little presentation he's going to open with, sort of laying out the theory behind land value return and recycling, various forms of capturing the value of land to fund public amenities like infrastructure, which includes land value, taxation. So we'll give a little background on that. And then I'm going to pose some questions to Rick, and we will also take whatever questions you guys in the audience have at that point.
Right.
So
and
you can take it away.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And just before I get into the presentation, you may be wondering that land value tax doesn't appear in the title of this talk, and I'll use that term sparingly. And the reason for that is that if we go up to somebody and say, oh, I see you have a problem with affordable housing or job creation or sprawl or trying to fund infrastructure, I have a solution for you. It's called the land value tax. And as soon as somebody hears that you're offering a tax to solve their problem, they say, well, we may have these problems, but no thanks, we don't want a tax. So I try not to use that term simply because when people hear it, they tune out almost immediately. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to fund infrastructure for affordable, sustainable, and equitable development. And hopefully it will make sense as we go along. I guess I have to figure out how to advance the slides. Here we go. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what I call the infrastructure conundrum. Now, infrastructure, things like streets, sewers, schools, police and fire protection, all of these things are created to facilitate development. But if infrastructure is well designed and well constructed, infrastructure inflates the price of well-served land. And these higher land prices chase development away to cheaper but more remote sites. Infrastructure is then extended to these remote sites only to have the cycle begin again as land prices again start to rise and development is chased even further away. And the result is something we're all familiar with, urban sprawl. And unfortunately, sprawl destroys the environment, it wastes existing infrastructure, which is underutilized, and it busts our budgets due to the expensive duplication of infrastructure. It's related to a phenomenon which I refer to as no good deed goes unpunished. So we may see a distressed community and think to ourselves, well, how can we help these folks? Well, maybe we could give them better schools, enhance public safety, or improve transportation to give them better access to jobs, education, and shopping. Well, if we accomplish any of these improvements, land prices and rents will rise, and many of the intended beneficiaries may be displaced as a result. In the end, tax dollars intended to help the poor end up enriching landlords who tend not to be poor. So why does this happen? Well, historically, population increases and infrastructure improvements cause land prices to rise, and private landowners can appropriate these publicly created land values. These conditions are the fuel for land speculation. Land speculation is buying land, not for the sake of using it, but simply to hold it, hoping that it'll be worth more in the future. Now, some owners will hold land off the market or ask higher than market prices in expectation of future gains. As a result, this land that's held for future development isn't available for development today. So land speculators create an artificial scarcity of developable land. But this artificial scarcity results in real increases in land prices. So perhaps some of you listening have heard a few politicians say, we want more jobs and more affordable housing. Or perhaps you've heard them say, we want businesses to flourish, providing goods and services to customers and employment to residents. Well, this is what we say, but let's look at what we do. If a landowner constructs or improves a building, the owner's taxes will rise. And they will rise not only when the improvement is made, but every year thereafter that this improvement adds value to the property. On the other hand, if a landowner allows a building to deteriorate or boards it up, depriving the community of housing and jobs, the owner's taxes are reduced. In other words, we punish those who provide housing and jobs while rewarding those who deny those things to the community. And owners of vacant lots and boarded up buildings pay less tax than their more responsible neighbors, even though the cost to maintain streets, sidewalks, and sewers are the same regardless of whether a lot happens to be developed or is vacant. So clearly, our economic incentives are upside down. How serious is this? Nationwide, the property tax on buildings is typically between 1% and 2% of value. This does not sound like much. However, unlike a sales tax, which is only paid once, the property tax is paid each and every year that an improvement adds value to the property. Using a net present value calculation, which is a way that economists take a stream of income and then collapse it into a one-time payment. Using this calculation, the property tax on buildings has an economic impact equivalent to a 10 to 20% sales tax on construction, labor, and materials. Now, if I went to a community and said, I know you're having budget problems, how about a 10 to 20% sales tax on construction, labor, and materials? Well, they'd say, Rick, we need money, but that's a terrible idea. This would make construction more costly, and the result would be fewer buildings and higher real estate costs for residents and businesses. Yet, without realizing it, that's what our property tax does today. So the other thing we need to think about is how people avoid taxes. As you know, if somebody imposes a tax on a good or a service or income or capital, people try to avoid these taxes. Taxes on buildings can be avoided by not making improvements or building buildings, allowing existing buildings to deteriorate, or if somebody really wants to build a new building, they can always build it somewhere else in a lower tax jurisdiction. The thing that's interesting about taxes on land is that they cannot be avoided. First of all, unlike buildings, the value of land is not determined by what the owner does. The value of land is determined by what nature does and what the community does around a particular site to make it an attractive place to live, work, or recreate. Also, I don't know if anybody in the audience has ever tried to move a piece of land from a high tax jurisdiction to a low tax jurisdiction. It's a very difficult thing to do. The logistics are horrible. You have lots of dump trucks, and at the end of the day, you still have a piece of land in a high tax jurisdiction. So as a matter of fact, we cannot move land from a high tax to a low tax jurisdiction. So what is the response of people to a tax on land value? Well, the response typically is to generate income from which to pay the tax. So the solution to these upside down incentives of punishing people who provide housing and jobs while rewarding speculators, the solution is something we call land value return and recycling. And it reverses these upside down incentives, specifically by reducing the tax imposed on privately created building values while increasing the tax on publicly created land values. This type of tax shift can raise the same total revenue as our existing property tax. However, the incentives are more fair and productive. Here's a graphic illustration of what's going on. And Daniel, can people see the cursor on the slide here? Daniel?
I can see it, so I'm assuming that others can see it.
Okay, so in this upside down triangle in the upper left-hand corner, this represents the general public. And they're paying taxes on labor and capital to the government. The government uses those taxes to fund public goods and services. And many of these public goods and services, if they have a locational component, like a street or a school, all of these have, or a transit stop, all of these exist at particular locations. These create land values. And under our typical property tax, only 1 or 2% of that value annually goes back to the government. The lion's share, 80 to 90% of the value that we're creating, ends up as a windfall to landowners, and particularly to a small set of landowners right here at the tip. I call these the owners of prime sites. And the thing that's most important to take away from this illustration is that most people end up paying for infrastructure twice. How's that so? Well, first, they pay in taxes to the government. But once that infrastructure is created, if they want to take maximum advantage of transit or a good school or a new hospital, they want to locate their home or business adjacent to that new or improved infrastructure. So they go to the landlord with a fistful of dollars and say, "Hi, here's my first month's rent." The landlord smiles at them and says, "Well, that would rent you any other place in this region, but here you're right next to this wonderful new infrastructure." So they demand a rent premium for people to locate next to the infrastructure that they've already paid for in their taxes. So here in the upper left-hand corner, you see a big fat downward arrow called rent. So that's the second way in which people have to pay for infrastructure. First through taxes and second through rent. The tax shift, or land value return and recycling, solves this problem in the following way. As you can see, what we've done is we've made land value return to the government more robust than in the previous illustration. I'll just toggle back and forth so you can see. And by doing this, we've made the provision of public infrastructure, public goods and services, more financially self-sustaining. And even if it's not completely self-sustaining, it's certainly more so than it was before. And this means, sorry about that, this means that we can have fewer taxes on labor and capital, and that helps the economy be more productive. And because land values are being returned to the government, it has a less inflationary impact on land prices, which means that homeowners and businesses can pay lower rents to locate near the infrastructure improvements that their taxes have already paid for. So as I mentioned, this is called land value return and recycling. When infrastructure is well designed and well executed, it inflates the price of nearby land. Returning publicly created land value to the public sector that created it and recycling it for infrastructure creation, operations, and maintenance is land value return and recycling, and I'll abbreviate that as LVRR. So why does LVRR work? Well, first, taxes that we put on privately created building values are a cost of production. Reducing the building tax makes buildings cheaper to construct, improve, and maintain. This leads to more buildings available at lower prices and rents. The second part, and this is perhaps the hardest part to understand, is that taxes on land values are not a cost of production because land is not produced. After all, there will be just as much land after we tax it as there was before. Taxes on land value are a cost of ownership. So by reducing the benefits of ownership, higher land taxes actually reduce what people are willing to pay for land. So the more you put a tax or fee on land value, the lower the price becomes. So without spending more money or losing any revenue, simply by shifting the property tax off of privately created building values and onto publicly created land values, this tax shift can make both buildings and land more affordable. This is good for residents and businesses alike. And there's an equity component because property owners will pay taxes in proportion to the infrastructure benefits they receive. The benefits of infrastructure, as we mentioned previously, are reflected in the value of land. So the higher the value of land, the more benefits people are receiving from publicly provided infrastructure. Therefore, this is a more fair and equitable way to fund that public good, those public goods and services. So as mentioned, taxes will be highest and the economic impetus for development will be greatest where land values are high. And land values are high adjacent to existing urban infrastructure. So these high value infill sites are where we want development to occur. And indeed, that's where the greatest incentives for development will take place. So in this way, we solve the infrastructure conundrum. We create more compact development because under the status quo, the higher land prices are chasing development away. Under land value return and recycling, these higher land values actually incentivize the owners to develop, therefore drawing development to the infrastructure rather than chasing it away. So land value return and recycling creates more compact development. This results in more walking, more biking, and more transit. And in terms of auto trips, you'll have fewer and shorter trips, which means less congestion and less energy consumption and pollution. And finally, and this is very important, compact development requires less infrastructure per capita. In other words, if we have 10 people along a single mile of road, they pay less tax than if those 10 people were located along 10 miles of road. So less infrastructure per capita not only allows us to spend less on infrastructure, but it means lower taxes for the people who live in our communities. And that's pretty much generally seen as a good thing. And finally, by drawing development to the infrastructure rather than chasing it away, we can preserve our rural areas for what they do best: agriculture, recreation, and conservation. So this sounds good in theory, but what about practice? Well, land value return and recycling has been used in some Pennsylvania cities. What they've done is a technique called the split rate property tax, where the tax rate applied to building values is lower than the rate applied to land values. Implementation began as early as 1913 in places like Pittsburgh and Scranton. In those jurisdictions that have implemented a split rate property tax, these communities have weathered economic downturns better than other jurisdictions using the traditional property tax. These are a few examples of what has happened in terms of development to communities where they've implemented a split rate tax compared to other nearby communities that did not. And I'll go into that later if people have questions. And that concludes my introduction. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Daniel, and Daniel can ask questions from the audience or any that might occur to him. Daniel, take it away.
Thank you so much for that, Rick. That was great. There was a lot of ground covered in that. So I want to pose a few questions to you first that might help draw out some of the big picture themes. Make sure they're really concrete for people, and then we can move on to any audience questions that we get. So one question that I would ask for you, you talked about this idea early on in the presentation of the infrastructure conundrum. And can you just revisit and kind of sum up fundamentally what is that?
The infrastructure conundrum is basically a phenomenon that occurs whereby we create infrastructure to facilitate development. And yet, if that infrastructure is well designed and well implemented, the result is higher land prices around that infrastructure. And while people might want to locate there, when they look at the higher land prices, they say, gee, I can't afford this. So they go and develop a cornfield where land is cheap, but unfortunately lacking in infrastructure. So people move into the cornfield and realize they don't have the infrastructure they need. They wave their hands at the politician and say, hey, you've got to extend the street or the transit or the water and sewer system to our cornfield, even though there's plenty of capacity where it was originally provided. And the politicians, being the good people they are, they extend the infrastructure to this remote development only to have the cycle begin again and have development chased even further away. Did that make it clear?
I think so, yeah. So you're kind of saying this infrastructure conundrum is that it's almost an inducement for outward suburban expansion as opposed to redevelopment in centrally located locations that are already served, and sort of intensification of the land use in those.
Exactly right. So we create infrastructure to facilitate development, but we end up chasing it away. And as a result, the infrastructure we create initially is wasted. We have to duplicate it at these remote locations. And the sprawl that we end up with is not only bad for the environment, but it's bad for our pocketbooks as well, because we now have much more infrastructure than we would need if development was more compact.
Right, right. Can you talk a bit more about the examples of places that actually have implemented some form of land value return and recycling or split rate taxation, about how that has either succeeded in encouraging reinvestment in the urban core, discouraging suburban sprawl, or otherwise what the economic effects have been?
Sure. Let me see if I can bring this up again and share this with the group. And let me find the area where I have some examples. Here we go. So here are some examples of the successful application of land value return and recycling. After the earthquake of 1906, San Francisco abolished the property tax on improvements, but retained the tax on land values. Of course, there was no federal emergency management agency at that time. There was no federal assistance to help San Francisco recover. But San Francisco was quickly rebuilt as a compact and vibrant city, in spite of the fact that there was no federal disaster relief. And why was that? Well, in part, it was because when people's buildings fell down or burned down, I think more buildings were damaged by the fire than the earthquake, their taxes did not go down that much because San Francisco was putting more of its tax on the land value than on the building value. As a result, the landowners had a strong motivation to get income from that property so they could afford to pay their taxes. So that was a very strong incentive for them to redevelop their properties, which they did so rather quickly. Another great example is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh adopted land value return and recycling in 1913. And several things that are interesting about that. First is during the Great Depression of the late 20s and 1930s, many major cities around the country saw the assessed value of properties decline by 25, 30, 40, even 50% in some cases. In Pittsburgh, assessed property values only went down by about 11%. Why was this? Well, in most of the country, before the Great Depression, there was a huge real estate speculation boom and bust. Because of land value return and recycling in Pittsburgh, land speculation was not a profitable activity. So there was no land speculation boom in Pittsburgh prior to the Depression, and therefore no bust. Now, clearly property values declined somewhat because many businesses went out of business during the Depression all around, but they fared much better than other cities. Another thing that was interesting about Pittsburgh was that in the late 70s, they had a budget shortfall of about $200 million. The mayor proposed a wage tax that was going to cost the average Pittsburgh family about $200 a year. People on the city council said, this is a terrible idea. This is going to drive families and workers out of Pittsburgh into the suburbs. Why don't we simply raise the money we need with a land value tax instead? So instead of increasing the wage tax, Pittsburgh increased its tax on land values. And of course, most of the land value in Pittsburgh was in the commercial center of the city. So most of these taxes were paid by the commercial business interests. So it only cost the average Pittsburgh family about $80 a year instead of $200. So that was a plus. A lot of people said, well, you're taxing businesses more. Businesses are going to move out of Pittsburgh. But they were taxing the land, not the buildings. Shortly after taxes were increased on land values in Pittsburgh, downtown Pittsburgh underwent a transition that is referred to as Renaissance 2. Lots of new corporate headquarters went up and there was a huge building boom in the downtown. And this is what theory would predict, but it's nice to see that it actually happened in practice. Another place that land value return and recycling was used in a rural example was in Ohio along the Miami River, where frequent floods were a real problem to farmers. So they installed flood control dams along the river, and they paid for these flood control dams by a special assessment related to the increase in land value arising from the reduced risk of flood damage for the surrounding farms. So those who benefited paid for the infrastructure. And here I have a slide that talks about McKeesport. The illustration seems to cover the text, but I could talk about this. One of the things that's interesting in the social sciences is that we rarely have a controlled experiment. Usually we do a policy change, something happens, and we say, that's great, but maybe that would have happened anyway. So we had as close to a controlled experiment as possible with three small towns outside of Pittsburgh during the mid-1970s. McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton are very similar steel towns just upriver from Pittsburgh. And in each town, the steel mills closed and the building permits declined for several years in a row. And all these little towns, they have the same population, demographics, same regional economy. They're all operating the same. But McKeesport then decided to follow Pittsburgh's example, and they adopted land value return and recycling, while Duquesne and Clairton kept the traditional property tax. Shortly after they implemented this tax reform, McKeesport experienced an increase in building permits. And of course, this is what the theory predicts, but as we said before, maybe that would have happened anyway. Well, we know that wouldn't have happened anyway, because just nearby in Duquesne and Clairton, building permits continued to decline in both number and value during those subsequent years. The good news is that when Duquesne and Clairton saw what was going on in McKeesport, they said, hey, we should do that. So then they adopted land value return and recycling, and building permits started to increase in those towns as well. So there's very strong factual evidence that this isn't just a good theory, it actually works in practice. And these are a few other examples, special assessment districts that have been used. In DC, we created a new Metro Rail transit station just north of Union Station in downtown Washington, DC, and special assessments on landowners near the station helped pay for over a third of the cost of that new station. So that's just another example in the transit sphere. In the early 1970s, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was very distressed both due to suburban flight, which was happening in lots of cities, but particularly because as a result of Hurricane Agnes, the Susquehanna River had flooded and the downtown was inundated. Harrisburg in the mid-1970s had 5,000 boarded up vacant lots and boarded up buildings and was listed as one of the most distressed cities of its time and its size. Harrisburg adopted land value return recycling in 1975, and over the next 15 years, the number of vacant and boarded up properties was reduced from over 5,000 to just a few hundred. So those are a few examples. I hope I didn't go on too long, but I hope I gave you a sense that both in rural and urban situations, land value return can be a beneficial way of funding infrastructure improvements.
Yeah, I think the the examples that are as close to controlled experiments as you get in a field like urban economics are really compelling. I see we have a couple audience questions here. Skylar, who I know is joining us from Pennsylvania, he asked about the Scranton versus Wilkes-Barre example. And maybe you would have something to weigh in there in terms of context. I'm actually familiar with Scranton quite well because I have family there. And one of the things that's really striking, Scranton is a city that's been through a lot of deindustrialization,
Right.
has had some real economic problems. When you go downtown, what you don't see is a whole bunch of surface parking lots. And I've been to a lot of places that have been through decades of economic hard times and have just hollowed out, and the core of the city is dominated by parking lots. I don't know Wilkes-Barre as well. I don't know the context that you may have, Rick, in terms of that example, but that's something that has always struck me in Scranton. And I know parking lots have a strong relationship to land speculation in cities.
Yes, and I too am not that familiar with Wilkesboro, but I do know Scranton a little bit. And again, talking about Pittsburgh, I mean, Pittsburgh lost, tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs in the late 70s and 1980s. And no city can suffer that kind of loss of employment opportunities and not suffer. So we should be clear, Pittsburgh, McKeesport, Duquesne, Clarendon, all of these cities suffered considerable distress as a result of the loss of manufacturing jobs. And if you go to these cities today, you will see that distress. But the point to be clear about, and I think you made this point in terms of Scranton, is that at whatever level of the business cycle a city is in, whether it's in the boom cycle or the bust cycle, it will perform better with land value return and recycling rather than the traditional tax. And as you noted about other Rust Belt cities, typically when a factory closes down or a shop closes down and the building becomes vacant, the assessor says, oh, that's a vacant building, that's not worth very much. And so the assessments go way down and the tax goes down, and it costs very little for that owner to simply sit and wait. And a lot of times they say, gee, the economy here isn't doing well. I could try to redevelop, but that's kind of risky. Maybe I'll just, since it's not costing me anything really to sit and wait, I'll just sit and wait. And maybe the city or the federal government will come up with some program or some infrastructure improvements to jumpstart development. So people sit and wait, or they put up a parking lot to make minimal income to pay the holding costs. And this is very destructive. But in cities like Scranton and Pittsburgh, when the factory closes down, yeah, the assessment of the building or the factory may go down, but because most of the tax is based on the value of the land, the taxes don't go down that much, which means that the owner, even though their building is no longer producing income, is still paying a high tax. That lights a fire under the landowner to redevelop that property and reuse it in a way that'll produce income. And so Pittsburgh and Scranton and other cities have been that use land value return and recycling have been much more successful than other cities in terms of making the transition from a manufacturing to a service economy. In fact, there was a study that was published in the National Tax Journal in 1997 that compared Pittsburgh to 15 other Rust Belt cities. And Pittsburgh was far and away an outlier. in terms of the amount of development in its downtown, whereas other cities, as you say, had hollowed out. The people who did the study did a multiple regression analysis, and they found indeed Pittsburgh's unique property tax regime was statistically significant as a causal factor in why Pittsburgh was doing better than the other Rust Belt cities.
I'd love to have you speak to one objection I hear a lot when we start talking about land value or split rate taxation, which is the question of who is going to benefit, who's going to be hurt, and in particular, is this going to fall on the average citizen? And I'm going to lump together a couple questions here. So one question is, you know, in these cases like Pittsburgh, how much of the burden fell on the average citizen? Who saw their taxes go up versus down?
Sure.
And then the other question that I would sort of lump in with that and let you sort of address as a unit is, in places that have really suffered a lot of decline, I've heard it said that there's a concern that, okay, you have this tax regime you're going to institute that encourages urban redevelopment in a place where the market's not ready for it. And is that just hitting people while they're down? Is that just, okay, now you have this incentive to redevelop property in a neighborhood that's really blighted, in a neighborhood where there isn't much demand. The taxes are, in order to keep up with them, in order to pay them, you supposedly have this incentive to make more productive use of the property. But what if the market simply isn't there? Or what if you're a poor person who owns a home in a neighborhood where you're close to downtown, and maybe to use real estate parlance, the highest and best use of that property would be a multifamily or commercial building? Are you going to be forced out?
Right. Well, those are great questions. I'll try to get to them, and if I skip something, you can remind me to get back on track. But first, I'll start off with who benefits and who loses. As I mentioned at the very outset, I often don't talk about land value taxation. I talk about land value return and recycling. People don't like the idea of a new tax. And what we're talking about is basically reforming the existing tax to get rid of bad incentives and promote good incentives. So it's a tax shift rather than a new tax. In fact, every city that employs a traditional property tax is employing land value return and recycling, because part of the existing traditional property tax, after all, is a tax on land values. So everybody's already doing it. It's just a question of doing it a little more and doing the bad thing, which is taxing building values a little less. In Pittsburgh, when this was done in 1913, they called it the graded tax. The reason they called it that was because it was implemented very gradually in small steps over a period of years. And the reason for doing this is because if it had been done in an abrupt manner very suddenly, it would have created windfalls and wipeouts. And of course, that's not the point of any tax reform, certainly not the point of this tax reform. The point is to create better incentives for more productive, sustainable, and equitable cities. So implementing it gradually avoids windfalls and wipeouts. And the question is, well, who are winners and losers? The good news about gradual implementation is even if you're a loser, because of the gradual implementation in the early years, you don't suffer very much, but you see where things are going. And this gives you a chance to reorient your investment behavior to take advantage of the new incentives. So now let's talk about who wins and who loses. Let's say we have a community that has only one property in it. So we're going to implement this tax shift in such a way as we raise the same amount of money under the new system as under the old system. Well, since there's only one property in this jurisdiction, its taxes are going to be the same. But of course, in most communities, you have multiple properties. And how do you know which properties do better and which properties do worse? The way to know is to look at what is the average ratio, and you can do this by looking at assessment data. What is the average ratio of building value to land value in the community? If your property has that average ratio, the same as for the community, then your property will experience no difference as a result of this tax shift. So just to use an example, let's assume that the typical property has $50,000 worth of land and $100,000 worth of building. That's that's what your property is worth. As a result of this tax shift, you'll see no difference. But let's assume that you have a bigger or better building than is typical than in your jurisdiction. Let's say you have $200,000 in your building and only $50,000 in the land. Under this scenario, you would probably see a tax reduction. And then let's say you had less building to land ratio than the typical. So let's say you had a vacant lot, a surface parking lot, or a boarded up building. Well, in those cases, your taxes would go up as a result of shifting the taxes off of building values and onto land values. So those are who the winners and the losers are. You have to do a sort of case-by-case study to know how a particular city will turn out, but in a number of cities have been studied. And in most cases, homeowners typically have a better building to land ratio than in the community as a whole. So in most places, homeowners tend to do well as a result of this tax shift. People who have well-developed properties in the downtown and commercial areas will also do well. People who don't do well, as I mentioned before, people who have vacant lots, surface parking lots, boarded up buildings, typically their taxes will increase as a result. So if a particular community is interested in pursuing this reform, certainly I can do this and others as well. We can go in, look at your assessment data and do a scenario analysis so that we can determine either by neighborhood or by type of property who does well and who does poorly, and how can we orchestrate this shift so that it's not a burden on the typical productive taxpayer. The next question you asked, and I think this is an excellent question, is if we shift taxes from buildings onto land, aren't we sort of kicking people when they're down if we do this in a depressed area where there's little or no demand for economic development? And indeed, the places where land value return and recycling has been implemented most often have been in distressed communities. And what you'll hear is just what you said, Daniel. The landowner will come to the city council and say, this is unfair. I mean, my land is sitting vacant. I would love to develop it, but there's no demand. Well, I would suggest that this landowner isn't being quite truthful. I would suggest that if we took some center city vacant lot, even in a depressed community, could be Detroit, could be Akron, Toledo, Gary, Indiana, you take your pick. If we took that vacant lot in the center of town and put it on the market for $1, there'd be a line around the block of people waiting to buy that piece of land. So the reality is not that there's no demand for that land. The reality is there's no demand at the price the landowner wants to receive. Now, in most cases, landowners think their land is worth more than what it really is. And the thing that's interesting about landowners is they can often avoid market signals in a way that in a way that other participants in the economy cannot. So Daniel, let's just take a hypothetical. Let's say you and I are hamburger flippers and McDonald's is hiring hamburger flippers at $12 an hour. You show up and say, yes, I'm willing to work for $12 an hour. I show up and say, yeah, I'm a good hamburger flipper, but I'm a special guy. I deserve $14 an hour. What's going to happen? You, Daniel, you're going to get a job. You're going to start making money, and I'm going to be unemployed. I'm going to starve. So it's very hard for me to ask for more money than is the typical going wage in a particular area. Alternatively, Daniel, let's say you and I are banks with money to loan for cars, car loans. And let's say the going rate of interest is 6%. And a person comes to you and says, Daniel, I'd like a car loan for $20,000 at 6%. You say, yes, I can do that. They come to me and I say, yes, I have the $20,000, but people who invest in my bank are special people. They deserve 7 or 8% interest. What's going to happen? Your money is going to get loaned out and start earning interest. My money is going to sit there and waste away in value. So the lesson is that labor and capital have to bring their resources into the market at whatever the prevailing wage or interest rate or return on capital is. Land tends to be different. Landowners often don't depend on income from land for their daily sustenance. So they're independently wealthy in many cases. And they know from history that the more they sit and wait, the greater the likelihood is that that land will increase in value over time rather than diminish. So landowners, unlike labor and capital, are encouraged to sit and wait or ask for prices in excess of what the market will bear today. So again, the owners of parking lots, surface parking lots and vacant lots and boarded up buildings are going to scream bloody murder and going to say, oh, this is terribly unfair, because they say there's no demand for their land. And this is simply not true. What's true is that there's no demand for their land at the price they're asking, but that price is probably in excess of what the market dictates. And what this type of land reform does is it compels landowners to be more like workers and capitalists, which is to bring their resource, their land, into the market at the prevailing market price. And this helps rejuvenate the downtown. So again, even in a distressed market, I mean, if you go to places like McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton that we had talked about before, these are still very distressed cities, no doubt about it. But they're doing better under land value return and recycling than they would have done under the traditional property tax. Did I cover the bases?
I think that was pretty thorough. Yeah, I want to take the last 10 minutes or so to get into some of the logistics and maybe even a little bit the politics of shifting toward this kind of a system. You've talked about why you were deliberate about not talking incessantly about land value tax, because people hear that word and they have a negative reaction to it.
That's right.
And instead, land value return and recycling. This is recapturing value created by the public for the public.
And I don't use the term value capture either for the same reason. People hear the term value capture and it's like, what is that? It's not intuitively obvious. And in the United Nations, where they were looking at this technique, they decided not to use the term value capture because people decided the term capture sounded aggressive and hostile. I think there have been some focus group studies done, and land value return and recycling actually gets a better reaction from people. So clearly, words matter. I mean, one of the things, just to go off topic a little bit, is a lot of people say, well, why are you against land speculation? I mean, you know, people who invest in land are taking a risk. Doesn't capitalism reward risk? Shouldn't they get a return? And because we use the word real estate investor, it sounds like or land investment, it sounds like they're doing something important. But in economics, investment is creating something new that will be productive in the future. When people buy and sell land from each other, they're creating nothing new. So that's why land speculation is a parasitic activity. But again, the words we use make a difference. If we talk about it as if it's gambling or speculation, people understand it. If we call it real estate investment, it sounds like a good thing. So likewise, if we talk about land value taxation or land value capture, people get all nervous and unhappy, and then they stop hearing the substantive arguments we make. If we refer to something land value return, well, what are we talking about? We're simply returning land value to the public sector which created it in the first place. And what could be more fair than that? So the words we use makes a difference. So vocabulary is important, and how we talk about it does make a difference. And I think I've gotten off track. You were asking me about how we move toward implementation?
Yeah, I'm wondering, I think the point about vocabulary is a huge one in terms of building awareness and building political support for these kinds of changes.
Yeah,
I
I
do
mean,
know some of the people's doing it around the country. I also know that there's a lot of pushback, often from a status quo bias or just loss aversion. You're going to
sure,
change the way I'm taxed. This is new. I'd rather stick with the familiar. And
right.
people intrinsically don't see the status quo as a distortion. I'm wondering what kind of incremental steps you would recommend that are short of a full land value tax or a
Mhm.
split rate tax as has been implemented in Pennsylvania. How do we start building politically or pragmatically
Right.
toward this
Well,
system?
let me start with the split rate, which actually is an incremental approach. As we talked about the way Pittsburgh did it, by gradually reducing the tax on privately created building values and increasing the tax on publicly created land value, Pittsburgh was able to make very small incremental changes, which over time had a very profound impact, both by allowing Pittsburgh to weather the Great Depression better than other major cities, and in a way that allowed Pittsburgh to become more economically robust in spite of the decline of manufacturing in our country's economy. So that's an example of incremental change. But how do you talk about it? I don't, again, even the term split rate tax will make people unhappy. So what I would do is I would call this proposal, if I was going to a community meeting, I would suggest that we adopt the universal tax abatement. Well, that will get people to smile right away. Oh, a universal tax abatement. Because typically what happens, and we were talking about this before, how people pay at least twice for infrastructure. Well, oftentimes they pay even 3 times because developers will try to develop near the infrastructure that we've created and decide that land prices are too expensive. So the big developer goes to the city council and says, hey, I want a tax abatement. And the city council says yes. So now the public has to pay for the tax abatement as well as the infrastructure. And then a third time they pay higher rent. So people are familiar with tax abatements, but they usually go to those who are politically well connected and powerful, and they don't go to most of us. So we end up subsidizing them. A universal tax abatement would reduce tax on every building in our jurisdiction. Every building owner would get a tax abatement, whether they were a mom and pop or a big commercial owner or a single family homeowner, whatever. Everybody gets the abatement. What could be better than that? Well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, land value return and recycling. So again, through the use of words and stressing the incremental nature of change, this is one way to approach the problem. The other thing that we can do, and this has actually been implemented many places, is we can encourage more jurisdictions to develop development impact fees. And when I was talking about the infrastructure conundrum, I talked about how development often is chased out into the cornfields. Developers buy land in the cornfield because it's cheap. And then when people move in, of course, they don't have the infrastructure they need. And the developer is sort of relying on the people who move into these new developments to sort of make trouble for the politicians so that the politicians extend the infrastructure and thereby subsidize the development that way. One of the things that some people have done is they said, well, this isn't fair, having developers develop our cornfields and then expect all of the taxpayers to subsidize that development by extending the infrastructure. So what some jurisdictions do is they impose development impact fees. Development impact fees say that in an area where infrastructure is lacking, the developer has to compensate or reimburse the jurisdiction for the infrastructure capacity that must be created to service that new development. And what that does, in a way, by increasing the cost of development, it helps level the playing field between our built-up cities and our relatively undeveloped suburbs, exurbs, and rural areas. So it helps level the playing field, and it does redirect some development back into the core where it belongs. So I think a universal tax abatement implemented incrementally and gradually, and the use of development impact fees in rural areas these are two sort of incremental approaches that can move us in the right direction. But both of these approaches do require authorizing legislation or permissive legislation at the state level. As is obvious from the fact that we used Pennsylvania examples, there is permissive legislation in Pennsylvania. In some states, either there is no permissive legislation or there may actually be a statute prohibiting this type of approach. So each state requires a case-by-case analysis and then an appropriate organizing campaign in response.
I have one last question for you, and it is an audience question, and then I'll let you make a couple concluding remarks. But Anthony wants to know, and this relates to the point you just made about state legislation and potential legal obstacles to this. Anthony asks, how can we implement land value return and recycling in California in the context of Proposition 13, which caps property tax increases,
Right.
For those who don't know, at 2% per year unless the property is sold. What would be the best way to achieve that transition? Anthony says maybe a local government could refund their share of Prop 13 and impose a special tax instead. Rick, I don't know whether or not you're any sort of authority on California, but that kind of legal obstacle, what do we do?
I'm not an authority on California, but I do know how Proposition 13 came about, and it's rather interesting. Back in the 1970s, Jarvis and Gans, the two proponents of Proposition 13, they had been for years calling for assessment freezes and tax freezes, and everybody thought they were kooks, which they kind of were. But there was a good government organization, I don't know whether it was Common Cause or some other group, that realized that there hadn't been a statewide reassessment in California for many, many years, and assessments were out of whack, and there should be a reassessment. So they did, a statewide reassessment. And not surprisingly, assessments went up maybe 5 times on average. Well, if you and I, Daniel, had been in the state legislature, and we'd noticed that property assessments had gone up by 500%, well, we probably would have said, gee, we should reduce the property tax rate by 20% just to sort of even things out. And that way people would pay roughly the same as what they were paying before. But the legislature was asleep at the wheel. They didn't change the tax rates. So when people's assessments went up by 500%, so did their taxes. And all of a sudden, Jarvis and Gans, who had looked like kooks before, all of a sudden they looked like heroes. And the people in the state legislature weren't going to say, hey folks, it's our fault, us elected officials, we forgot to lower your tax rates. Well, no elected official was going to blame this problem on themselves. They said, yes, Jarvis and Gans are right. It's those darn assessors who raised your taxes. And so Proposition 13 got implemented. It froze assessments and required, I think, a supermajority, 2/3 vote to raise tax rates. And it created a very uneven and difficult tax system. And yet this type of approach spread like wildfire across the country. I think 42 states adopted clones of Proposition 13, and they're all suffering as a result. So this is a challenge. To the best of my knowledge, there are people in California who are working on how to repeal or amend Proposition 13, but I would just suggest that if people watching are from California, that they try to get involved in those efforts, because Proposition 13 has not delivered the promises that it made. The people who advocated for Proposition 13 said, once we freeze assessments, home prices will be much more affordable in California than before. And exactly the opposite happened. And we, having just experienced this presentation, would know that by reducing the tax on land in California, that would cause land prices to soar. And that's indeed what happened. So, you know, the thing that's confusing is the property tax. While we talk about it as if it's one tax, it's really two. It's a tax on privately created building values, and it's a tax on publicly created land values. This is a distinction that most people don't make. They don't even know it exists. And therefore, we have a lot of education that needs to happen to help move people into a place where they can make better policy choices.
Rick Rybeck, thank you. This has been fascinating. By way of conclusion, I just want to ask on behalf of our audience here and anyone who wasn't able to join us for this today, are there any follow-up resources that you would recommend for people who want to know more about this subject matter?
Sure. Let me just bring up, if I may, a concluding slide with the, whoops, wrong slide. Let me bring up the, this is sort of the main points that I hope people will take from today's discussion, which is that land value return and recycling can help generate revenue, it can advance critical infrastructure investments, and it can help achieve transportation development and other policy goals. It also creates land use incentives, and in particular discourages sprawl, which is a big contributor to global warming. And as I mentioned, it's not only bad for the environment, it's bad for our pocketbooks. And finally, land value return and recycling can help make tax burdens more equitable and fair. Infrastructure beneficiaries will pay in proportion to the benefits received, and the public sector will be more fairly compensated for the publicly created benefits that they provide when they produce infrastructure. So those are the main conclusions. And in terms of resources, let me see if this is my information. You can Google Rick Rybeck and you'll probably find my website, which is www.justeconomicsllc.com. I have lots of articles and other resources at that site. I've produced a number of reports as well as articles. So if you want something that's easy to read, there are some easy to read articles. If you want some more dense reports, academic studies, I recently had an article published in a law journal. Those are available on my website as well. So, you know, people should feel free to get in touch with me either by phone or by email. I'd be happy to respond. And I'm on Facebook and I'm a member of the Strong Towns group. So people can reach me that way as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I would just add, in addition to Rick's organization and his resources, Strong Towns did publish a series of articles on land value tax back in March of 2019. You can find all of them at strongtowns.org/landvaluetax, one word. And we tried to take a much less academic approach that would be accessible reading for, say, your city council person who you're trying to introduce to the subject matter. And one of the articles in that series was actually contributed by Rick. So make sure you guys check that out as well. strongtowns.org/landvaluetax. And you've got Rick's info here, Rick Rybeck at justeconomicsllc.com. Rick, thank you so much for joining us today. This was great.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and a big hats off to you and your whole team at Strong Towns. You're doing great work and helping us find new approaches to problems that have sort of puzzled and befuddled us for a long time. And I think thanks to the Strong Town team, there are new and productive policy avenues to pursue.
Absolutely. These are kind of perennial human problems that we're dealing with here.
That's right.
Policy can do a whole lot.
And the thing we talked about earlier, the no good deed goes unpunished. I mean, how many people say, oh yeah, here's a distressed community, we want to do something good for them, and then as a result, people complain about gentrification, and then people throw up their hands and say, oh, it just goes to show there's nothing to be done. Well, hopefully in our presentation today, we learned that this no good deed goes unpunished conundrum can be overcome if we have the right policies in place. So we can solve problems, we can make progress, and we shouldn't be discouraged. What it takes is just a willingness to act, a willingness to get beneath some of the problems that are in part created by the bad vocabulary we use, such as referring to real estate speculators as investors instead of speculators. So yes, I think the Strong Town team is helping us move in this direction, and I'm feeling encouraged. I hope your audience does as well.
I think we do. I'll let that be the final word. Thank you, Rick, and thanks everybody for viewing. Keep doing what you can to build strong towns. Bye.
Bye-bye.